Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our three-part colorism series with the Racial Unity team. Today is our third and final session of the series, and we are discussing beauty and the beholder, colorism, and the lessons we teach our children with Professor Halliday. I would like to give a thank you to our grantors, New Hampshire Humanities and Kennebunk Savings. I also want to give a thank you to SAU 16 for their support in this program. We want to thank our presenters for joining us on this panel, and a special thank you to the Racial Unity Team Board Chair for organizing this amazing series. Just a few Zoom rules for today. We are recording this program so that we can post this event to our webpage for others to view. If you would not like your face to be visible on the recording, please feel free to turn off your video. Please make sure your mics are muted during the discussion. Please be mindful of others, as there is a large amount of individuals on the chat and background noise will interrupt the speaker. If you must leave early, please feel free to do so without interrupting the panel. Today, for our question and answer section, we're doing it a little bit different. After Professor Halliday's presentation, there will be two parts to the Q&A. Part one, we will invite you to share a question based on today's presentation. And in part two, we want you to reflect on the symposium's topic, colorism, and the previous two sessions. So please feel free to use the chat area for questions. We will make sure we discuss those questions you list. And if we are able, we will call on those to ask their questions as well. I would like to now introduce our moderator and presenter for this series, Cabria Baumgartner. She is an associate professor of English and American Studies at the University of New Hampshire. She's the author of the award-winning book, In Pursuit of Knowledge, Black Women in Educational Activism in Antebellum America, which tells the stories of African-American girls and women who fought to democratize public and private schools in the 19th century Northeast. She is currently writing a biography of Robert Morris, one of the first African-American lawyers in the United States. So with further ado, I turn it over.
Thank you for that introduction, Tanisha. Good morning and welcome to all of you. This is the third and final panel of our symposium. And I must say, this has been so enriching for me, and I hope for you as well. Before I introduce Professor Halliday, I'll provide a brief definition of colorism. And I'll also write this definition or type this definition into the chat. And then I'll give us some food for thought about how colorism relates to racism. So I think, of course, starting with the work of Black women makes much sense here. Two Black women in particular have given us a great starting point for understanding colorism and racism. One is African-American novelist and activist Alice Walker, and the other is Black actor, filmmaker, and author Lupita Nyong'o. So in her essay, an essay in her book actually, Alice Walker defines colorism. And this book is called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which was published in 1983. It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. And this is where Walker defines colorism. She says it is prejudicial or preferential treatment of same race people based solely on their skin color. So Walker goes on to add that oftentimes this means privileging light skin over dark skin. And we know that colorism isn't really unique to the United States. It's a global problem seen within ethnic groups across East and South Asia and Latin America. So think about advertisements for skin lightening creams in South Asia. So skin color matters, and there's a link between colorism and racism. And Lupita Nyong'o has a great way of looking at it. So she says that, quote, colorism is the daughter of racism in a world that rewards lighter skin over darker skin. And Lupita is a dark-skinned woman whom I might add is quite beautiful, quite stunning. But she's described the challenges she experienced growing up in Mexico and Kenya, and then later trying to navigate Hollywood, right? And Hollywood's conception of beauty. So she wrote this children's book called Sulwe about a dark-skinned girl who learns to love herself. And this is a book that I highly recommend that we read to all of our children. It's one that I've read to my children because we need to really celebrate these representations of dark-skinned girls. And Professor Halliday will talk more about that. So this link between colorism and racism is important to understand because one, colorism and racism are part of a caste system. And two, this caste system ultimately fuels whiteness and white supremacy. So let's keep this in mind as we listen to Dr. Aria Halliday. Dr. Halliday is assistant professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies and the program in African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Halliday specializes in the study of cultural constructions of Black girlhood and womanhood in material, visual, and digital culture in the late 20th and 21st centuries. She engages broad interdisciplinary interests in sexuality, Black feminism, and radicalism in Black popular culture in the United States and the Caribbean. She has published widely in scholarly journals. She is the editor of the Black Girlhood Studies collection, which you can buy. We'll drop that in the chat too. And she's co-editor of a recent special issue on hip hop feminism in the Journal of Hip Hop Studies. And she is the author of the forthcoming book, Beyond Barbie, Nicki Minaj, Disney, and Black Women's Cultural Production. And that'll be published by the University of Illinois Press. She's currently on research leave, having earned the prestigious Woodrow Wilson Career Enhancement Fellowship. So we're lucky that she's here sharing her intellectual insights and energy with us this morning. So please join me in a virtual round of applause to welcome Professor Halliday.
Thank you, thank you. First, thank you to Dr. Baumgartner for the invitation. I'm really excited about this conversation, mostly because it intersects with my research, but also that there are all these people on a Saturday morning that would say, I want to sit and listen to someone talk about this. That continues to amaze me. I'm thankful that so many of you are here. I'm thankful to the Racial Unity team and the work that you all are doing and in New England. I think it's very important, so I'm glad to see it happening. I should say too that I live in New Hampshire. I was a colleague at the University of New Hampshire for 3 years, and so that's how I know Cabria. And while I'm even a part of this whole conversation, so although my institutional affiliation is in Kentucky now, I do have a warm place in my heart for New England. So I'm going to share my screen just because I have a few slides, because I find that many of the things that I talk about are better understood visually. And so I have a couple of images that I'll talk over and kind of narrate to you. And I hope that it doesn't come off as being distant, but rather that I want you to know all the things that I do so we can have a robust conversation afterwards. Does that sound good? I'll take thumbs up from everybody that I see. Awesome. Usually when I'm doing it face to face, I'm like walking around and talking to people. So this feels weird just to talk to myself, but we will get started nonetheless. Let me share my screen. Okay. And we can see this, yes? Thumbs up. Yep, okay, thank you. So, of course, our discussion today is Beauty and the Beholder, Colorism and the Lessons We Teach Our Children. I'm really going to discuss, what it means to talk about play and beauty and that relationship. Specifically going to focus on my research on Black dolls and this kind of conversation about multiculturalism, or what we might call diversity, that's come out in the past 30 or 40 years or so. And then we're going to jump to questions because I can talk forever, but I'd rather you ask me a question than me talk about it, right? So let's get started. I hope most of you are comfortable and knowledgeable about the Dr. Mamie Kenneth Clark dolls tests. They were conducted in New York City and Clarendon, South Carolina, from 1939 to 1947. And ultimately, the doll tests wanted to explore how Black children became racially aware through play. So they asked about 300 or so children, give me the doll. And so they have a Black doll and a white doll. They asked them, you like to play, which was the doll you like to play with, which is the nice doll, which is the bad doll, which has a nice color, which one's white, which one's color, which was Negro, right? And we can even think about what those words mean and what they might connote differently. And then which one looks like you. And the Clarks, what's interesting about their study is that they argued that because many of the Black children identified good qualities, nice, it looks nice, which one's white, with the white doll, that it illustrated a particular type of poor self-esteem or poor self-confidence because they didn't necessarily identify with the Black doll. And when they did, they identified it with negative characteristics, right? Although there is some misconception, I would say, in psychological circles about how the study was conducted, it continues to be a point of reference even today. There was a study that came out this week even from Mattel and who's the company who makes Barbie, showing that doll play allows children to feel empathy even when they're playing by themselves. And so naturally my question, and they don't have it in the study at all, which you might imagine, is, well, which children are illustrating empathy and which dolls are they playing with? Because ultimately there's a difference between playing with a doll that looks like you and playing with other dolls. But we'll jump more into that in just a second. So I think it's important to establish a kind of timeline of the ways that Black people in particular have worked within doll companies to illustrate a type of like racial uplift or racial understanding of oneself, particularly for children, right? Which they argue is important for self-esteem, for kind of an awareness of self and racial dynamics in the US. You understand that even with the Clark doll studies, which really were foundational to the Brown v. Board of Topeka, Kansas decision in 1954, which outlawed segregation in schools, right? That dolls and understanding racial uplift is something that's been going on since the early 1900s, right? So we have here Richard Henry Boyd from the National Negro Doll Company, which was based in Tennessee. They were the first kind of iteration of what he calls a Negro doll for Negro children. He makes the argument that if you really wanted to illustrate that you were a race-loving people, you would buy this doll, right? So specifically tying one's understanding of themselves, of their racial identity, and even how they're raising their children to the purchase of a particular item, right? The P&M Doll Company is the first white company that starts to mass produce Black dolls with names like Daisy and Topsy, and we can talk about why they might use those names. Marcus Garvey and the UNIA Doll Company started making what they call dusky dolls. So contemporary to the period, right? Dusky is a word to describe dark skin, right? And it was kind of an innovation at the time because most of the dolls were very light in complexion, which really had to do with filaments and plastic and those kinds of things. There are a couple of others. I want to specifically talk about Sara Lee Creech, or the Sara Lee dolls, which is pictured here next to this timeline. In 1951, Sara Lee Creech is a white woman who was friends with very prominent Black intellectuals. Ralph Bunche, of course, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was involved, Zora Neale Hurston. There are a lot of important people who helped create what they call the first anthropologically correct dolls. They studied the faces of over 100 Black children and really developed a doll that would look exactly like, in their words, look exactly like a Black child, which is the image that you're seeing here. I don't think I had this doll, but I had a doll that looked very close to this. It was one of my first and actually the only doll. I don't really care for dolls, and we can talk about why that is in a minute as well. So much of my research continues to track the ways that Black people in particular, but Black companies really try to create this narrative of racial uplift through dolls, because it continues to communicate what we care about, who we think we are, and as Mattel's study just showed a kind of empathy towards Black people, Black conversations, and Black complexions and hair textures. So here we have Shindana Toy Company, which was based out of the Watts riots in LA. The doll company was gifted, and we could talk about what gifted means as well, gifted about $200,000 from Mattel to get their company off of ground. And they started to make these dolls that specifically were geared towards, Black children and a kind of Black aesthetic. You see with the Malika doll here on the left, that she has an Afro-styled hair. She kind of has an Afrocentric style of dress. And you kind of can see in the background of her box, a kind of safari style background to the box. They also started making the Wanda career girl dolls, which as we might talk about, are reminiscent of someone we might remember who's the career woman or Barbie, right? But this predates Barbie by a little bit. And I argue in my book that much of the work that's happening between Mattel and Shindana is this kind of relationship that Mattel then borrows to create their own Barbies. We can talk about that as well. Okay, so Mattel's first iteration of a Black doll is Colored Francie. That was her name. She was only released in the UK in 1967. She's here on the right. And she was Francie, the white Francie who's on the left was the cousin of Barbie. And they created a Black version. She didn't sell well. She was never released in the US. And they moved very quickly on to developing other dolls. They first came out with the Julia doll in the US. It's the first doll that was released here that was Black, which was depicted off of Diane Carroll's character in the show Julia. And then they also released Malibu Christie, the doll with the santan look, which was supposed to be a play on Barbie's kind of Malibu dream house aesthetic. In 1980, they hired the first Black woman designer at Mattel. Her name's Kitty Black Perkins. She's from South Carolina. And she developed this doll, Black Barbie. Now, this is the first time that Mattel is kind of interested in really developing and naming Barbie herself Black. And so you can see here on the left that she's Black, she's beautiful, she's dynamite is on the box. She has kind of an Afro-styled hair. She has kind of a disco kind of look to her if you think about what the 1970s and 1980s looked like in terms of style. And then on the very back of the box, which is why I have it here, they even have a description of how you might fluff her hair with a pig, right? So actively working with children to learn, right, the differences between hair textures and how you might work with them, right? Which I think says a lot about beauty standards, right? Even when they're saying this is not, they're calling her Barbie, but they have the disclaimer on it, right? That it's Black Barbie, not the same as the blonde hair, blue-eyed Barbie. Kitty Black Perkins continues to try to work with what they're doing at Mattel. She develops the Shiny dolls. It's a line of 3 dolls. There were a dark skin, a medium brown, and a light skin doll. In 1991, they had the dolls always get released at the Toy Design Festival in February. And this particular doll was released in February, which you know now is Black History Month. They had the group In Vogue, it's an R&B group, come and sing the what is now called the Black National Anthem, or Lift Every Voice and Sing. It was a kind of very aesthetically Black affair. They wanted you to know that these dolls meant something particular to Black culture. Even the name Shani comes from a Swahili word, a Kiswahili word for beautiful. They're really intentional, particularly I would argue that Kitty Black Perkins was really intentional about creating dolls that spoke to a particular Black culture and imagined self of Blackness, right? Kitty Black Perkins left Mattel after hiring the second designer, Stacey McBride Irby. And Stacey McBride Irby, in my conversations with her, talked about how there's a lot of competition between designing dolls like Shani versus designing dolls like Barbie, right? A lot of the designers that she worked with wanted first that Barbie had everything that they needed because that was their premier doll. And then all the other dolls, right? They had a Black doll, they even had a Latina doll, Marissa. They really worked to try to like expand, but it was only after Barbie got kind of the first design, the freshest designs. And so Stacey McBride Irby worked on her own designs called Sew and Style dolls in 2009, they were released. And what's interesting about the Sew and Style dolls is you can see here, there's a kind of plethora of them. There are a lot of different colors, a lot of different textures. There's adult or, teenage girls, there's smaller ones. It's this idea that like older girls are able to play with their younger sisters. Each one had their own kind of booklet to them that would talk about, I want to be a cheerleader, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a scientist, what they did at school, who their friends were, where they came from. And what's interesting also about these dolls is that they were based not in Malibu like kind of previous Barbie iterations were, but they were based in Chicago, which I argue is a kind of geographical understanding of where Black people live, right? That they're trying to infuse the doll with this understanding. They also worked with some urban clothing companies like Rocawear and Baby Fat, which are really important in the 90s and 2000s. If you think about Kamora Lee Simmons and those kinds of people who are developing brands for people. And so they thought, okay, well, you can dress yourself, you can dress your doll, so you can kind of create this relationship around what you look like in your aesthetic from how you play. Now, these kinds of ideas I think are super important because of something that I pulled from Bell Hooks, and I have her quote here from her book, Outlaw Culture, which is that unless we transform images of Blackness, of Black people, our ways of looking and our ways of being seen, we cannot make radical interventions that will fundamentally alter our situation. And I would argue that much of the conversation that we're having around colorism, both today and the past couple of sessions, right, is about making radical interventions in the way that we understand race, but also how we understand color. Because those ideas in themselves and how we continue to map them onto the ways that we play, the ways that we worship, the way that we love, the way that we interact with other people, right, frames not only the world that we continue to live in, but the world that our children and our grandchildren think is normal or is right or is comfortable, right? That exposure means a lot because that radical intervention means that we're actively shifting the world that's happening. I'm going to stop there because I want to hear your questions. That's my favorite part of this. Feel free to email me. I'm also on Twitter, which may not mean a lot to you, but feel free to contact me in that way. And I'm just excited to hear more of your questions. That's my favorite part of this. So let's get to it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Halliday, for that. It was wonderfully insightful. And we're going to come back to the Bell Hooks quote and this idea of radical intervention, because I think that is partly what we want to do with this entire symposium. So I invite questions. I see there might be some in the chat, so I will ask that. And if you want to ask a question, feel free to start your video and unmute yourselves. The first question in the chat, you probably see that. Explain the terminology of daisy or topsy in the Barbie industry. And I just want to add to that also this idea of the Dusky doll. If we think about some of these names, I mean, Topsy, I'm thinking of Uncle Tom's Cabin, yeah. But Dusky, are these terms, Dusky, is that a term that's negative? Is it kind of a pejorative, or has it taken on that meaning later?
That's a great question. So I would say that you are right on point with the Uncle Tom's Cabin in terms of the use of Topsy. So the kind of history of dolls in general is that Black dolls are made from a kind of cloth or material, whereas white dolls were traditionally porcelain, right? So the white dolls were porcelain, you put them on a shelf, they were collector's items. These are not dolls that you play with, they will break instantaneously. And those who had dolls like that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But Black dolls were usually made from a kind of cloth. So there's a really great author, Robin Bernstein, who has a book called Racial Innocence. And she talks about how these dolls were used to play everywhere because they're cloth. You can toss them around, you can throw them. And there's this one really interesting chapter in her book where she talks about how white children at the turn of the 20th century, right around Uncle Tom's Cabin and those kind of conversations, are playing lynching scenes with their dolls, right? Or they're playing whipping scenes with their dolls or burning them or whatever, right? And so she talks about how this kind of kind of psychological relationship to play, right, informs not only what they see, but then vice versa, right? The ways that they play informs what they see, and then what they see informs how they play. And so Daisy and Topsy were the names of some young Black girls in a particular period. Topsy in particular is very popular. And Topsy, I should say, although the main referent, I think, is Uncle Tom's Cabin, there are a lot of different iterations of Topsy that, again, Robin Bernstein talks about her in her book, that come from plays, they come from opera, they come from, it was kind of a catch-all, a kind of pronoun, if you will, for young Black girls in that particular moment. Daisy is used similarly. I hope I answered that question. And I think the second part of what you said was about dusky and about whether or not it was pejorative. And I think at the time there were words like high brown. High brown is very popular word at the early 20th century to describe a kind of medium brown or light skin kind of complexion. And so I think dusky developed as a way to talk about a darker skin, right? A kind of a tangibly darker skin. And I think that, like, even if you think about somebody like Cinderella, right? Her, like, a girl with cinders, Cinderella, right? This kind of idea that you need something to describe the darkness of it. I think that's where dusky comes from. It was more a descriptor than kind of a pejorative phrase. But I definitely think 21st century, we can see like the ways that we might describe it, right, have a kind of pejorative connotation to it.
Right, and I'm thinking about, you talked about sort of materially how dolls are made, and porcelain sort of conjures up the sort of beauty in and of itself, right? That we think about that, but then dusky, right? The words even that we use to describe color are really quite loaded. There's another question about the Kenya and Addie dolls. Can you talk a little bit about those?
So I think what's interesting about every time I do this presentation, right, someone asks about Addie. And I think what's interesting is although I don't focus on Addie in my research or Kenya, I think that the American Girl dolls have a really important kind of place in American popular culture, particularly because there are a lot of mothers and parents in general who said, I don't want my daughter to have Barbie, but I'll buy her American Girl doll. Now, what's interesting about that is American Girl and Barbie are owned by the same people at this point. And so even the ways that we might understand, I'm doing something that means something differently, right? You're purchasing within a similar kind of construction, right, of doll culture and beauty. But what I'll say, what's interesting to me about Addie, and I think what most critiques are of even Addie, and the more recent one is Melody, I think, is she's supposed to be a civil rights kind of representation doll for the American Girl line, is that while some of the white dolls in American Girl kind of pantheon kind of stand in for anybody, I feel like the very few examples that we have of dolls of color in the line mean like they're supposed to take on this kind of huge historical moment. The explanation is gigantuan. If you think about one doll explaining the civil rights movement, for example, I mean, that it's hard to understand, right? I think that my issue, I would say, the issue in the research I always come up against is I think it's very important to have these examples, to have these representations, but what do we lose by not having multiple representations or diversity of representations, right? The more that we have, right, helps us to see multiple avenues, multiple ways to understand it, right? What does it mean to have a high brown doll and a dusky doll? What does it mean to have dolls from the 50s and the 80s and the 2000s, right? They all represent something differently. And I think that although American Girl and some other kind of popular dolls do a great job of having multiple examples, they are all very limited. There's only one, right? Which, you know, in larger conversations about race and racism, right? And especially in New England, people would say, well, you know, one is not a threat, so we can live with one.
So there's a question, I think during your talk, you talked about, I think this is about the businesses, the gifting
Oh, yeah.
one. Yeah, so can you explain that?
Well, so the relationship between Mattel and other companies, as you might imagine in a capitalist society, is, in my mind, is never benevolent, right? So Mattel, one of the designers, one of the kind of first women designers, Carol Spencer, she's very popular if you're in like Barbie collector circles. Carol Spencer was kind of very popular, worked for Mattel for 40 years, very well-known white woman who designed a lot of the early dolls and eventually hired Kitty Black Perkins. And what's interesting about Carol Spencer is that she says in her own memoir, and she said in an interview with me, that the relationship between Mattel and Shandana was one in which Mattel would send resources. They would send money, they would send people to help them kind of get the marketing off the ground. They would send advertisers. I mean, there were a lot of people who were going there. I mean, this is like 15 minutes away from each other. So they would send people all the time to like work with them, right? Shandana, they get themselves off the ground. They argue that they're part of this organization called Operation Bootstraps, right? It's really kind of concrete understanding of like Black economic development. They sell really well. They're selling $1 million a week at one point, and then they kind of falter in terms of being able to supply as much as the demand is, right? So once they go under, right, they're not able to continue to make the same amount of dolls for the same amount of money. Mattel starts developing dolls in this vein, right? So my argument, Mattel would never tell you this, right? And don't tell them I told you this, but Mattel would never say, right, that they use the information that they gained from what they saw with Shandana to develop their own dolls. But before Shandana goes under, Mattel is not making any Black dolls. They don't have any examples whatsoever of dolls that they're trying to make in that vein. And so I can only assume that they got involved with Shandana, right? Gifting them $200,000. I put gifting because they, you know, some of them are arguing, is it $150,000? Is it $200? We didn't give them any money at all. It was just kind of informal, whatever. There's, you know, and you can imagine that Mattel doesn't want to tell me either, right? So, you know, I argue that in my book that it's not this kind of benevolent, larger white company wanting to help this Black company get off the ground, but it is a kind of exchange that then Mattel benefits from, right? Because Shandana has already done the work to, you know, get suppliers, they have advertisers, they have marketers, they have a market already. They have, like I said, they're selling $1 million in dolls worth a week. I mean, Mattel knows that they'll have people to buy their dolls if they decide to make them at this point. So that's kind of why I put gifted in quotes. I might get sued if I say something else.
That's right, that's right. We don't want that. And Colored Francie was Mattel's UK version, or was that a different company?
Yes.
So, yeah.
The whole Francie line was a UK version. And then, so it was, Francie was supposed to be, if you remember, like the Beatles and mod fashion and that,
okay.
right? So she's kind of the mod cousin, specifically to bring in that kind of UK excitement and implosion that's kind of happening at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that Mattel would think that maybe Black dolls weren't lucrative, right? If the UK market was any indication.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a great point. And to think about this too globally. There's a question about the Wanda career doll, which predates Barbie, as you said. Was Wanda the first working girl because Black women historically worked in domestic labor and other jobs?
That's a great question. I'm not sure in terms of research that she's the first working girl, right? I think that there are multiple ways that children are taught with their dolls to like perform particular domestic tasks, right? But I think Shandana, Shindana's Wanda is the first one that had multiple careers, right? So I showed one example, but she was an astronaut, she was an executive, all the things that, like Barbie at this point is at like 2,000 careers or something like that, I think they promote, right? Wanda, though, was the first one that had multiple careers, right, in this kind of fashion that we see Barbie pick up afterwards, which is, I think, the point I was trying to make. I think the argument that you're making here, though, about the kind of domestic labor and other jobs that Black women have had, I would argue that the Wanda career dar is perhaps a little bit different, because I'm not sure that Black women were astronauts, or, I mean, they were, but like the kind of popularity of them, the idea of them is not, because I can think of Mae Jemison, right? But they're not happening in the same way. And so I think it's the first time that we really see Black women in a kind of executive type of space. They are, I don't think it's considered the same way now, but, it used to be that pilots and stewardesses were a kind of executive, glamorous job. And like Wanda, that was one of her first jobs. And she, and so I think that they were particularly trying to write Black women into a conversation about particularly middle-class labor. That I think is different than the kind of domestic labor that Black women were known for and kind of railroaded into in a lot of spaces.
I think that's a great point about class, right? And bringing Black women into these middle class professions. There's a question about colorism and gender. And we talked about this a little bit in the previous session, but we'd like you to expand on this. Is colorism only a female concern? All the references to dolls are female. Do males experience the same preferential treatment because of lighter skin tones? And I suspect we probably have to sort of confine this within the US, within the US, because I imagine it would be different in other environments, so.
Right. I would say that boys and men are affected by issues and conversations around colorism, but usually not to the same extent, right? So if we think about beauty culture generally, like as large scape, right? The ways that beauty culture comes after women in general, right? About hair, about complexion, about freckles, about, eyebrows, about, right? Like literally everything on a woman's body is up for the kind of debate and conversation about whether it is too big or too small or too thin or too wide or whatever, like everything. And I think there are a lot of ways that men's culture, although there are preferred body types, right, that continue to get kind of taken up, that there isn't a kind of larger conversation about colorism that is devoid from racism, right? So if you think about like the last 20 years and, the sexiest man in the world kind of narratives, right? I mean, they're almost all white men, but more recently they've picked people like Idris Elba, for example, who is a very dark-skinned Black man, an actor, which I'm not sure that like the sexiest woman alive has similar kinds of choices that are being made in terms of beauty culture in the US. So my general like kind of short answer would be like, yes, they're affected, but I think that the impact is a little different.
This is there are two questions that sort of speak to how and why play and dolls might be important. The first question is, how important is it for parents to provide the array of diverse toys for their children? And it kind of goes back to the point you were making earlier about the diversity of multiple representations. Can you speak to why that's important?
Well, I think that, so I could answer this super generally, but I'm going to make it specific to my own experience, right? So everyone in my family is my complexion. We all look about the same. And that's historical. Like you look at old pictures of my grandmother or whatever, we're all kind of dark complexion people. And so I grew up not thinking that there was anything particularly interesting or odd or strange or whatever about being dark skinned, right? But you go into schools, right? And we know children are mean. And so I feel like you go into schools and you realize, right, there are these points of concern, I should say, right? These points of people, bullying you or being mean or commenting about, right, that can become, kind of points of self-esteem, right? And you're like, oh, well, I don't like my hair because so-and-so, mistreated me because of my hair, or somebody, right? So I think it's super important for parents to provide multiple examples as early as possible, right? So it starts with, you suggested, Cabria, the Lupita Nyong'o's book, Soulway. I remember one of my favorite books, it continues to be one of my favorite books from when I was a kid, is Sharon G. Flake's The Skin I'm In. And that book is about a very dark-skinned girl whose father is the only person who reminds her that she's beautiful. And she goes through school every day, right, with people bullying her about how dark-skinned she is. And she comes home and her father's a person that like reaffirms for her, like, no, you're beautiful, and this is why, and this is, you look like me, and I'm beautiful, and you're beautiful, right? And has this kind of relationship with her. And then her father passes away, right? And so she has this kind of rupturing of self that happens because she no longer has this kind of point of reference. And so I would argue that parents have this very important place, both in the opportunities they provide, but also the kind of conversations that they have with their children about what is, acceptable and beautiful and wonderful about them, especially in an environment. I don't know if people are following the kind of judicial rules around the Crown Act, for example, which is a legal battle that's happening in many states. It was passed in California in particular, that are about, Black women's hair. And so there have been some stories in the past couple of years where you see Black children being told they can't come to school if their hair is braided, they can't come to school if their hair is in dreadlocks, they can't do this, they can't, right, having their dreadlocks cut in class, stuff like that. And so the Crown Act is a legal battle really that's happening across the states, and they're pushing for a kind of national recognition of it, that there's no discrimination on the basis of hair or hair texture. But you can imagine if it's being raised to the point of legal battles, right, that it's something that's very important to the kind of self-esteem and understanding of Black children, but also really anybody that has a texture that's not completely straight, which is most of us, honestly.
That's an important point. Yeah. These things intersect not just personally, but with the state, right? With law. So these are very important matters. So we have one question about from Rebecca Wilcox. She says, I live in an area that is overwhelmingly white. Outside of dolls, books, and pop culture items, such as Black produced TV shows and movies, how might I provide authentic experiences of diversity for small children? And so you've sort of addressed this in those conversations that parents would have, and then in textbooks that they can read, like The Skin I'm In. Is there anything else you would add to that?
I think that partially because I study it, right, I have to make the argument that popular culture is the thing that's going to really do it. Because most of us, right, in terms of seeing lives that are not like our own, pop culture is the way that we do that, right? So through shows, through films, through books that we read, we might hope that our children are interacting in spaces where people are different, right? And I have to be very clear that just because people look the same does not mean that they are the same, right? So there is some ideological and socioeconomic and kind of geographical and just life differences that provide a kind of diversity, even if it's what we might consider a racially homogenous space, right? And so I think encouraging people to actually have conversations with other people, ask them what their lives are like. When I was a kid, my mom likes to tell a story of how I was the kind of kid who talked to anybody. I didn't care how old or young they were. So encouraging your kids to talk to people, I think, is helpful. I just was interested in people's lives and their stories, and, how did you get to be in this place right here? And why do you live here? And why do you make these choices? And where do you go? And I think being upfront with your children about the life that you live, right? The things that you desire about, if you care about diversity and inclusion and thinking about people who are different, like, expose your children to those stories. I think if you are listening to an NPR story where they're talking about some other opportunity, think about how to frame that as a way to have a conversation with your child about it. I think, a lot of times we separate adult culture from children's culture, but so much of the ways that, children are going to understand and interpret the world are through the ways that adults interpret the world, right? So part of the argument that I was making about Mattel, for example, and the Barbies and dolls that they're making, is that these are adult women mostly, but there are some men who are involved, but these are adult women who are interpreting, right, what kids should play with, what the doll should look like, what clothes they should wear, whether Barbie should have, you know, a vagina or not. I mean, those are adult kind of conversations, right? Whether she should have breasts, right? Those are adult kind of conversations that then become interpreted to the way children understand bodies, right? And so if you think about that relationship between what you know as an adult and how you informed much of that information from when you were a child, or the lack of information from when you were a child, right? That relationship is really close. So I would say, you know, if you're thinking about it, talk to your kids about it.
I really like the emphasis too on the power of popular culture, right? Good, bad, and in the middle. And I like your point that maybe it is through popular culture that we're going to change some of these representations. So we may not be able to totally avoid it. I see that Professor Bell has his hand raised. I don't know if he wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just briefly. First, amazing presentation, Dr. Halliday, big fan. But I just wanted to say, you know, I was thinking about this point about being in an environment where an undiverse environment, or maybe we could say an unrepresentative environment of the larger demographics of the country. I think maybe one other thing we might think about, and I was reminded of this in Dr. Halliday's presentation, when she talked about how the Black Barbie was labeled as such, as Black Barbie, and how, you know, they didn't turn around and also say, now we're going to call Barbie White Barbie, right? So how can we think about ways of unsettling the idea of whiteness as the racial default? Right. And I think one way to do that, in addition to acknowledging, you know, skin tones and body types and all the rest of it more openly, is also to label things as white, which are specifically white, as opposed to just acting as though that is the default sort of category. So that's something I run into teaching early American history a lot. When we say Americans, a lot of times we actually just mean white Americans, but we say Americans. So trying to be specific about who we're talking about, I think that's a reminder to everyone, children and adults, that there are a variety of experiences and subjectivities out there that that deserve to be kind of acknowledged as such. And I think that acts as a way of making us more conscious of race, and that's the sort of the first step, I think, to dismantling racism and colorism. So just my 2 cents on that. Yeah,
that's a great 2 cents.
Maybe 3 cents.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, 3 cents. I'll give you a nickel for it. How about that? I think that's so important to think about the ways that the words that we use definitely contextualize who we're talking about, but also who is the default, right? And so if we're assuming that we live in a diverse society, which we do, and that, you know, it's going to continue to be more and more diverse, right? That understanding that diversity is expansive and doesn't start with a particular assumption about who is the most diverse or who's the least diverse or whatever, right? I think it's super important. It's a great point.
I agree, that's a great point. There's a question about beauty in a really interesting way. So the Clarks in their doll test showed that kids' views of dolls reflected internalized racism, right? Because I remember, I guess in some reproductions of it, you had Black children who would say, oh, the Black doll is bad, which means they're sort of internalizing this degradation. Do dolls, Black or white, support positive self-images if the dolls are all drop dead gorgeous?
That's a great question. I think Mattel would argue that all of their dolls are drop dead gorgeous, and so of course that they do. But I think that, so if you're following any of this doll culture stuff at all, so Barbie released what they call their fashionista line in 2017. They're supposed to be, you know, they have a tall, they have a petite, they have a curvy, some of them have blue hair, there's afros, there's all kind, like shaved sides, there's purple, there's lots of different things happening with these dolls. And the argument is, you know, well, we want people to see the kind of diversity of experiences and just life differences that are possible. But even after they did this kind of change, right, they had children from multiple types of backgrounds come in and say, they said, okay, they laid all these dolls out and they said, okay, which one's Barbie? And they still picked the thin white, blonde, and blue-eyed one, right? And so they've already, to John's point earlier, they've already, right, 50 years, you know, Barbie came out in 1959. They've already 50 years of creating this doll, right? Barbie is synonymous with white, blue-eyed, and blonde, right? And so developing now at this really important point, this diversity of Barbies is not going to change the kind of original referent in the minds of children, right? Because even, and this is the point about popular culture that I think is super important, in all of their pop culture representations of Barbie, so not the dolls, but they have video games, they have television shows, they have movies, all of this stuff, Barbie is only white and blue-eyed and blonde. Right. So if these children, in their hopes, these children are playing with the dolls, they're playing with the video games, they're watching the shows, they have the bed, the bed coverings, they have pillows, they have shoes, they have shirts, right? This is like the model of capitalism, that in all of these examples, Barbie is always white and blue-eyed, right, and blonde. Then it doesn't matter the other ways that they try to demarcate Barbie, because they've already decided that she's always blonde, white, and blue-eyed, right? I think I lost track of your question, but I think, you know, part of the art, something about them all being drop dead. I think that ultimately that that the work is not just rhetorical, right, but it's ideological, right? It starts at the basis of ideas, and that, you know, making them all beautiful, for example, does not necessarily change the ways that children are going to interpret, right, who's the normal one or the right Barbie, because they've already created the referent that Barbie is always, right, this one particular thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You know, even if we sort of limit our children's access to television, I have an 8-year-old, and, you know, so I let her watch like one show a week or something, whatever I can limit, right, exposure. But, you know, she'll go through, you know, the kids' version of Netflix, and she'll see Barbie and Friends. And Barbie is, as you said, white, blue-eyed, and blonde. And that's the default. And she'll ask me, can I watch it? And I say, no. You know, like, no, you can't. You're going to be saturated with Barbie all the time. You're not going to watch that one. But you know, it's like, as a parent, I feel like sometimes I have to, you know, then explain why, you know, there are other shows that I think are more representative, you know, that are more diverse, that speak to a multitude of experiences, right? It starts those conversations, but you're absolutely right that we're inundated with Barbie material, Barbie culture, and that the default is white, blue-eyed, and blonde. I wanted to highlight, or do you want to speak to that?
I was just going to follow up with the fact that, like, part of the research that I do, I'm really focused on dolls in this conversation, but I also study Disney, right, which is the other kind of huge referent when you're talking about children's culture in general. It's like dolls and Disney, and that's it. And I think that's super important that in much of the ways that like Frozen was taken up, for example, as kind of the most recent example, right? Prior to Frozen being released, they had these holiday doll packs where you could buy the whole princess pantheon at one time. It's 8 dolls, right? So they had Jasmine, they had Tiana, which is the first African-American doll. They had, you know, Pocahontas, and we can argue about why they would even do this, right? But they would argue you can buy this whole pack, your kids will get 8 dolls, right? They get everybody, and it's done. After they released Frozen, they have both Anna and Elsa in the box, and they've removed Tiana. So you literally cannot buy a Tiana doll just about anywhere. Can't see it on the shelf. You can never find it, right? And so when you think about, like, they've taken out one black doll to put in 2 white ones, right? And even in Anna and Elsa, are both of them princesses? Frozen, are they? One's the queen and one's the queen of the sister of the queen, right? Yeah. Like, that's it. And so it's interesting that they included her in this kind of princess pantheon. Is she included? Is she not? But that is supposed to be, as John again reminded us, right? Like the default is that a princess is supposed to be white. And so I think that it matters a lot when you talk about, like, diversity of what you're getting, that many times via capitalism, right, you can only buy the ones that are the most popular, but also the ones that are most produced, right, that are going to make the most money, which are usually ones that are have the most backing from the company, which is the ones that are white.
I think that's a great point. I wanted to highlight some of the conversations in the chat. So I'll just read a couple of these. Tanisha was responding to sort of Rebecca and the great, what you shared, your insights, Dr. Halliday. So Tanisha said, it's also looking at your internal space and how you promote diversity. Look at your circle of friends and family. How do you and those around you talk about diversity and other racial concerns? Is your circle of friends diverse? And so it's not that you need to go seek Black friends, but are you welcoming of others and encouraging your kids to talk to others and hear the stories, like Professor Halliday is discussing? And then Tanisha said, opening our children to diversity can also mean experiences and activities as well. It's how we educate and expose our youth. And I think that's a really important point, and precisely what I think the racial unity team is doing, right, in Exeter, but throughout New Hampshire, is we're trying to sort of share these experiences.
No, wait for me.
Okay. And then I wanted to also just add Bob Thompson's point. He talks about, or I don't know if Bob, if you want to come on the call, I just realized I don't have to read these, but if you don't want to come, I'm happy to share the.
Yeah, I'm here, I can read, but I'm not quite in a position to be seen. So I was just trying to communicate that. I grew up during a time that these Black dolls became more popular. It was during the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. Well, really, this is during the 60s. And it seemed almost that, so there is this aesthetic tyranny that has at the top of the pyramid everything European. That's the top of the aesthetic pyramid, and near the bottom is an Afrocentric aesthetic, which during my upbringing was everyone was trying to elevate. We were trying to claim that, and like if you were a light-skinned Black person, you wore the biggest afro you could, and you found the darkest skinned Black person to be your mate or your partner. But what happened was that the absence of any images in the Barbie pantheon that reflected Africa. There were no dark ones. They didn't have the right lips. Their hips were too small. All this stuff, and those skinny legs. They did not look like women in our community looked. So there was room to claim a different aesthetic while we were growing up. I don't know how successful it was, because you're always fighting against the dominant and the assumption of the norm, which is, again, European. But it was in many ways freeing during that time, because there was no expectation that they were supposed to look like Barbie, or any judgment that was the aesthetic by which young Black girls were being assessed. And it really is an assessment for women, I think, unfortunately.
Right. Bob, that's such a great point, but I think that also, so Shandana is coming up around the same time that you're talking about. And I think that what's interesting about what you said, and even the studies that I've made of that particular period, right, that there are assessments and judgments that are being made about how Black you are, even if, right, the referent isn't necessarily whiteness anymore, but it is a particular type of representation of Blackness, right? So people like Angela Davis, for example, who's very fair, right, worked really hard to make her afro look the way that it did, right? There's a lot of people who hair texture, right, became a point of concern because they couldn't perform this huge halo afro. That was kind of becoming the referent, or they weren't dark enough, or their lips weren't big enough, or their hips weren't wide enough, right? And I think that regardless of, and part of where my book lands at the end is that regardless of, whether we say that the referent is white or the referent is Black, that they're already kind of siloed into a particular idea of what that means. And most people don't fit in either one of those spaces.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I wanted to invite Tanisha into the conversation. You made the point about Tiana. Do you want to expand on that?
Sure, you see me chatting it up in the chat. The story of Princess Tiana, it always has, I love Princess Tiana, she's my favorite. And there's several reasons, it was Disney's first Black princess, right? And I feel that Disney relied on Black culture to really profit for this movie, right? They relied on us to provide that revenue. They knew we would soak it up, which we did. You know, and I bought the dolls, you know, I bought the DVD, you know, all of that stuff. It was finally showing that there can be a Black princess, and not a Black princess who just, you know, fell into the lap of, you know, marrying a prince or looking for that knight in shining armor. It was a Black girl who was working hard, who had a backstory of some trauma, or at least some, you know, things that she had to work through with her family, with her father passing away, and, you know, her having to do what she needs to do, but also find herself. And she happened to do that through having connections with her circle of friends, and that falling in love with that person. It was great music, a great storyline. But unfortunately, Disney, like you said, did not promote this movie. You know, you talk to most Black children and you ask them what their favorite princess is, and they will tell you Tiana, because Tiana looks like them, felt like them, lived in an area that they may know of, that they can relate to. You talk to most white children, and I've done this with, you know, nieces and nephews of mine, and I'll say, do you know about Princess Tiana? And they're like, who? No, I've never heard of her. And it's interesting because, you know, Disney will play every single movie all the time. You know, they do the releases of the, you know, oh, it's 60 years since Cinderella, and make a big deal out of it. You know, they're redoing movies, you know, into live action things, but no one ever talks about Princess Tiana. You don't see the dolls. You don't see, you know, the cartoons being made or the spin-offs and all of that. And it makes you wonder why. But why also, as white parents, did you not go see Tiana? I mean, it's a question, it's an uncomfortable question, and there's not, you know, any shade or anything with that. But why, when Princess Tiana movie came out, did you not rush to go see the movie like you rushed to go see every other Disney movie, Mary Poppins and, you know, Cinderella and all of that? So it's like understanding your own internal, you know, questions, and it's things that, you know, everyone asks, what can I do to promote diversity, or explain to my kids that we're open and we're inclusive and we're not racist, you know, and all of that. But it's asking yourselves those questions and having those conversations we need to do as well. So that's all. That's my 2 cents.
That's actually one of my least favorite movies.
Oh no.
I was like, this is gonna get me in trouble. She's just talked so wonderfully about it. Oh my gosh. But no, I mean, part of it is that I've watched that film probably 100 times at this point to study it, and there are some issues with that movie. I mean,
I'm coming from just a pure entertainment value.
Right, of course.
You know.
There's entertainment. There's some really wonderful, kind of very specific, like what I argue is kind of the Disneyfication of a tale, where you get a lot of the kind of like romance and the magic, and there's a lot of music. The story, music is great. All the actors are great, wonderful, whatever. The reason why I started to study this film, right, is that although it's about an African-American girl in New Orleans, supposed to be kind of jazz age, 1920s-ish, whatever, that the only way that she becomes a princess is by her boo kissing somebody else who's a white woman who was the princess only because her daddy was Big Daddy Warbucks, who had all the money in town. Also, she goes through this kind of harrowing tale as a frog. There is no other Disney princess who was an animal at any point in time. There is not a moment, right? Everyone has a friend. Even Pocahontas has a raccoon that they love, right? All of this. There is not another princess that is an animal, ever. And also the kind of historical reference about like Black people being animals, specifically frogs and monkeys and those kinds of things. I was like, oh no, Disney, come on. Yeah, there's so many opportunities. There's so many possibilities.
Right.
Why does she have to be a frog? For I mean, 95
3/4,
minutes
yep.
of a 98-minute movie. She's the frog for most of the movie. I'm sorry, we are devolving into like Disney.
No, but you're absolutely
right. But I have to say that, I would encourage you, of course, if you've never seen the film, right? Princess and the Frog is the film. If you've never seen it, I would encourage you to see it and recognize the beauty and the wonders and the magic, but also recognize some of the kind of underlying narratives, right? That like her and the prince are hopping around as frogs in a bayou being chased by white dudes. Like they're getting caught in cages. I mean, there's some really strange kind of undercurrents that I think are ultimately racist, right? So I think like going back to what we were saying earlier, I think there's one thing to say about like representation and it looks really nice, but there's something else to be said about the ideologies that undergird it, the ideas, right, that are written into this kind of narrative that seem normal, right? They're like, oh, well, yeah, people are jumping around as frogs, why not? And it's like, well, actually, there's some other ways that we might read this, right? That there are actually a lot of Black critics and Black people in general who hated the film because of these kinds of like underwritten racial ideologies that are input in the film, right? Same is true for Pocahontas, same is true for Mulan, same is true for, right? Like you can pick another one in which, you know, they're representing, I mean, there are people who had issues with Tangled, right? And the way that it represented, you know, Irish culture, right? So I think there's one, we can't expect Disney to ever get it right? So that's one, like it'll never be, right, what we hope representation to be, right? White pop culture in general, to bring it back to some of the conversations we were having, pop culture in general will never be representative of everybody. It can't be. Right? Popular in a sense means it's going to rise above a particular type of stereotype or expectation. But I think that means that it's kind of to my point that we have to continue to inundate ourselves and our children and other people around us with multiple versions, right? So if your only version for a Black princess is Princess and the Frog from Disney from 1997, I mean, like, or from 2007, like that's it. But there's so many other, right, of Black royalty in lots of different ways. I'm not promoting, you know, Wakanda or anything like that, but because that was also produced by Disney. But you can, I mean, there's other examples, right? I mean, there's just many historically and present, many examples of royalty, if that's what you want. But Disney is not going. They're never gonna get it right.
Yeah, right. Like we need more, we need a diversity of representations even within, you know, Black films or Black produced films, right? As many perspectives as we can get. I want to thank you, Dr. Halliday, for fielding those questions and for the wonderful questions that have been in the chat. I want to move to the second part of the Q&A to continue our questions. But just to sort of broaden, to ask you all, as you reflect on the symposium's topic of colorism, and if you were able to join us for the previous two sessions, are there any lingering questions that you have, either about the history of colorism in history or literature, or anything that you want to raise with the panelists, which include me, I think Amanda, Corey Graves is on the call, Ken Mindus is on the call, and of course, John Bell and Professor Halliday. So I'll just give a couple of, just wait a little bit in the chat to see if there are any sort of broader, large questions you have about colorism. Oh, Violet Anderson has a question, which is maybe general, maybe we can all address it actually, although it goes more toward Dr. Halliday's expertise. Are children seeing color difference at an earlier age now? If so, is it a result of popular culture?
I would say that that's a correlation that maybe a child psychologist might be better suited to, because I don't really study like when children first decide to see a particular image. But I will say that because of, you know, exactly conversations like this, right, many corporations are forced, right, to consider multiple types of representation. They're forced to consider what it might mean to, you know, have Doc McStuffins on one station and another, you know, Blue's Clues, or if you're talking about younger children, right? Or they're using animals like Baby Shark and all this other stuff rather than using people, right? They use a different referent. And so I think that it does allow children to see multiple types of representation, maybe prior to going to school or prior to being exposed to different people. But I would say that children learn difference very early, right? I mean, it's one of the first things that's developed in terms of a fetus in the womb, eyes and ocular muscles and those kinds of things. Like, you get eyes, you get sound very early. And so I think that kids, babies even, right, at a very early age are able to distinguish the difference between mommy and daddy, even through smell. Right, they're able to distinguish the difference between mommy, daddy, and somebody else. Like, somebody else wants to hold me. No, I don't know who that is. I don't want them, right? So I think it's important that we, you know, don't assume that it's, you know, at an age that's like 5 or 6 or 7, where kids seem more mature to have these conversations about difference. They notice very early, right? The difference between, you know, quote unquote, a boy and a girl, or a difference between, you know, someone who wears glasses and someone who doesn't, someone's hair texture, right? They notice those kinds of things very early, although they may never comment about it because they don't have the language, right? And so that, I believe, is your job as a parent, to kind of facilitate that knowledge acquisition. I hope that answers.
I know that our daughter was 3 when she came home, and we had raised our response to how to raise our daughter and our son with a racial consciousness in this community was to make sure that in our home all of our images were of Black folks, and we never discussed it. We just made sure that what they saw reflected who they were. But she was 3 when she first went to preschool, and the first comment she had when she came home was about the color composition of her class. Another incident that this is all just show that children are very aware of color difference. I was standing, a colleague who was a pastor of the Baptist church in town. He and his wife and I and his son was there. Their son was about 3, maybe 4, and he didn't want to shake my hand. And his parents were very embarrassed. They said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And he, hiding behind his father's legs, said, "I don't like people who don't look like me." So that told me that children don't necessarily learn this stuff first from their parents. I mean, I'm looking at his parents. They are mortified. They don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. They don't know what to say. But their child, I don't have any reason to think that they taught their child that. This is their son making sense of the world that he inhabits. So I just think that we have to be very, very, looking back, it would have been great if they had doubled down into it. Say, look, he's different, but look, and just they kind of tried to do that, but I think I just wanted to let them off the hook more than I did anything else. But I don't know, you know, when I hear myself speaking this, it's rather troubling to me. But I think that things being as they are, I'm still living here. Other people who look like me are still living here, and the demographics are still largely the same that they were when my children were growing up. This is likely to happen again. I think you just have to double down on it and take advantage of this opportunity to teach about difference and not to be afraid of it.
Thank you for sharing that. It's also sort of reminding me of the importance of, and it goes maybe back to Tanisha's point, do we have friends that we introduce to our children who don't look like us, right? So that child who couldn't shake your hand, I would presume, had not seen anyone who looked like you. And so that's important, because that means that maybe we need to be exposing our children to a variety of different cultures and different people, and so they're not so surprised, right? And quite frankly, so they know how to move about the world, because this is a very diverse world. I don't know if John, Aria, if anyone else wants to weigh in.
Yeah, this is Ken. You know, I brought up my children. I made sure, and I was living in Newport, Rhode Island at the time, close to the War College, and we have all kinds of students from all over the world coming in there. And I would always have them gather in my house at different times whether they're from Kenya or Ethiopia or Tonga or places like that. And my children, and we had them for dinner and stuff like that. And my children were always there with these events. So I think the exposure question early in life, we as parents have to do that somehow, whether it is, I know in New Hampshire it's a little harder, but there are books and other sources of information that you can expose your children at a very young age. So there's an expectation when they go out into the world that there are people different from who they are.
That's great. And it brings me to a question that's come up in the chat, which is recommendations. And maybe Professor Halliday, you can speak to this. I remember there was a question about some popular culture items that, quote, get it right in terms of representing Black experiences, or we could say maybe the experiences of dark-skinned people. And then there was another related question about books, right, that tell the story of maybe racism or colorism in this country. And any of the panelists can weigh in and share.
So I think it's really difficult to ask a pop culture scholar to tell you the ones that get it right. Part of my job is to tell you the ones that get it wrong. So I'll say that I think Doc McStuffins is really cute as a show that doesn't, I think, point to a particular kind of conversation about race and racism, but it provides, I think, multiple ways to understand kind of the family life, the experiences of a Black girl and her mother, especially, who's also a doctor. And she's like, you know, recreating these kind of vet situations with her pet or her toy animals. So I think that's very cute. You know, I think there are a lot of interesting things on television right now. And you forgive me, I study a little bit older than like really young kids, and so I don't necessarily have reference for like 3-year-olds or something like that. But you know, there are what is that show? Raising Dion is a very interesting show that's on Netflix right now. It's a young Black boy who has kind of science fiction-y supernatural powers, but it's really interesting. He's very smart. It's a very interesting conversation. I think there's also this is a little bit more if you're talking about like middle school, high school age kids. There's a show called oh man, it just went. But there's a show about Atypical is the name of the show. That's about kind of high school, almost college age white boy who, though, is interested in, you know, he loves sea animals in particular. He loves animals, but he's also on the autistic spectrum. And I think it's a really great kind of just conversation about like how life forces you to ask different questions. They even go back to when he was young and what kind of the mother and father are feeling during those times. It's a really great show if you're like an adult and wanting to figure that out. I don't know if kids can watch that. There are attempting to be sex scenes. They're not actually sex scenes. Oh, you know, I haven't seen it in a really long time, but Dora the Explorer used to be really good in terms of learning various things about different cultures and backgrounds and languages. Mm-hmm. I would say, you know, seek it out. There are definitely I mean, PBS, right, is one of those places that like continues to be a main referent for like not only like news stories about things that are popular culture that might be helpful, mm-hmm. but you know, if you're wanting to have a conversation with anyone about like race in America or whatever, PBS continues to produce really great documentaries. Even if you want to say, we'll watch 15 minutes of this and I'm going to have a conversation with my kid about, you know, what this might mean. Or I think using the resources that are available, especially freely available, is probably one of the best things. But to answer your question directly, I'm not sure that anybody gets it right. And I think that part of my argument is I don't know that we can expect pop culture to ever get it right, mm-hmm. right? Because it is kind of one example that's driven by capitalism that is creating a kind of stereotype right, to then represent life to you. It's never actual real life, right? So the best example is always actual people and experiences.
Sure. Thank you for those recommendations. I second, because I kind of watched them, I guess, Doc McStuffins and Dora the Explorer. I've seen a couple of, my kids really like Paw Patrol. I don't know, I haven't looked at it closely, but they seem to like it and it seems to be okay. So there was a comment from Sarah in the chat, and I just wanted to read it and then maybe link it to the sort of final question or action item that I want to, want us to leave here with. Sarah said, "Don't let us off the hook. You are 100% right to use what we as parents and adults are observing, use it as a teaching moment constantly about all things related to humanity and the treatment of others." So given that, maybe we can drop this in the chat and I can highlight a couple of your responses. But just take a few minutes and think about one tangible thing that you can do, that we all can do, to address the problem of colorism and, of course, related to that, racism. And so just feel free to type your responses in the chat. We've got some great ideas here too from our panelists, Professor Bell, Professor Halliday, Professor Ken Graves and Amanda Ken Mindus and Amanda Corey Graves, who've given us a lot of food for thought. So if we can just drop in the chat what we might do to address these problems of colorism and racism, that would be great. And I will also write mine in the chat. All right, so I just posted my action item. I will look forward to reading your action items here in the chat. In the interest of time, though, I will turn this over to Sophie. I want to again thank the Racial Unity team, Ken Mindus for organizing this, and all of our panelists who've really done a phenomenal job talking about and addressing this issue. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So I'll turn it over now to Sophie.
All right, thank you. I have been enormously impacted by this series, and I just want to reflect a little personal story that in March, I remember being in a meeting with Tanisha for the Racial Unity Team Programming Committee, and she, for the first time, brought up the series, that the series was going to happen in the fall. And I knew kind of the concept of colorism, but I had never heard the term. And so I asked the question, like, well, what's the difference between colorism and racism? I didn't really know. I hadn't heard that term and been explicit about it. So I just, for my own learning, I have gotten so much out of this, and just want to share that one personal change in my life has been that I'm expecting a baby girl in around New Year's Eve. I'm pregnant, and in her crib now is this beautiful mermaid. So I was thinking about that a lot today, talking about dolls, and just wanted to share that this doll is in the crib before my daughter. So yeah, I've gotten so much out of this. I'm sure all of you have too. And if you have, I invite you to join me in donating to the Racial Unity Team. A lot of this work was put on by volunteers. The Racial Unity Team is a wonderful nonprofit. It's a 501c3. And one of the ways that you can leverage and use your skin privilege, if you have lighter skin like I do, is to donate to organizations that are led by people of color and Black people. So please do join me in giving $5, $10, $50 if you're able to. It will really go a long way in not only allowing us to do more programming like this in the future, but to compensate our speakers of color who give their time and their wisdom and their energy to this programming. So I'll leave it with that, and just there's a lot more that the Racial Unity team has coming up. I'm helping to facilitate a series in October, later October and November, of Racism 101. So if you're hungry for more, you want to do more, make sure you sign up for that series. And with that, I will turn it over to Ken.
Thank you, Sophie. My name is Ken Mendez, and I chair the board of directors of the Racial Unity team. Sometimes in life, words have a way of sinking into our brain and changing our life for the better. Words are helpful to anyone looking to get inspired. Words are powerful as they are meaningful. These impactful words of wisdom from our speakers and others should inspire us to dig deeper and leave us with purpose and motivation. During the symposium, experts on topics of colorism like Professor John Bell, Professor Aria Halliday, and Professor Baumgartner shared their stories and shared their expertise with us. Each shared their knowledge and years of research, giving us information to formulate our views on this complex social issue. We also heard from Amanda Graves, her reflection and experience growing up in Malaysia and how her skin color impacted her life. And so I say to her in her native language, terima kasih Amanda, kerana bercakap mengenai colorism di Malaysia. Translated, thank you, Amanda, for speaking about colorism in Malaysia. All of our speakers' words inspired us and now leave us with purpose and what to do with the knowledge we have gained. Ultimately, it is for each of us to decide what to do. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to use that knowledge that you have obtained at the symposium to make the world a better place for your children and their children's children. Whatever we choose to do, be persistent. Change never comes easy, and doing nothing is not an option. Thank you for being part of the symposium, and thank you, my friends, for being such a wonderful audience. I want to thank Dr. John Bell, Dr. Aria Halliday, and Dr. Cabria Baumgartner for their time and work they put into making this symposium a success. A special thank you to Dr. Cabria Baumgartner for participating in our project planning work and for being our humanitarian expert on this project. The results of what was shared at the symposium speaks volumes. Denisha Johnson, our project manager, who is a member of the board of directors of the Racial Unity team and co-founder of Black Lives Matter Seacoast. Yay! Thank you, Tanisha. We could not do this project without you. And Sophie Saltonstall, a member of the Racial Unity leadership team and founder and board chair of the board, Robinwood Center in Stratham, New Hampshire. Thank you, Sophie. You do such a wonderful job of tying everything up together. And thank you to Superintendent SAU 16, Dr. David Ryan, for his support and for getting the word out into the schools. We have 1/3 of the people that registered for this project are teachers, principals, professors, and school administrators. We are reaching into the schools. Thank you to staff at Exeter TV, Robert Leckaway and Hillary Donnelly, for your work in making this video version available for public viewing on local TV channel 98 and on our website, racialunityteam.com. Thank you to all the volunteers, too many to be named who contributed their time and expertise to help make this event possible. To the Racial Unity Team Board of Directors, many of whom are present here today, thank you for your continued support. A special thank you to New Hampshire Humanities for their grant and for the event sponsor Kennebunk Savings for financial assistance to help bring this event to you. And lastly, thank you to all of you out there who have donated. It is through donations like yours that help us to continue to be able to bring projects like these to the public. To donate, visit racialunityteam.com. In an email that I will be sending out, you will receive a link to an online survey, and I encourage you, each of you, to take a few minutes to complete the survey. The information you provide us in the survey will help us improve the work we are doing in the community. Thank you, and please do not forget, make a plan to vote, vote, vote. Every vote counts, and thanks again. It is done.
I think we're unwilling to let go. I think we're hoping for an opportunity to continue to talk on some level. That's what's going on.
I mean, you're welcome to. We can leave the chat Zoom open, and that's not a problem at all.